So I'm really glad to see all you people here. My presentation is going to be at a slightly different scale from Sarah's and Kath's presentation. And yes, I'm generally going to relate it back to the Geographe Marine Park. Now, I've put a picture of a hat here and a telescope to point out that I'm talking with lots of different hats on. So I'm a researcher at UWA. I look after lots of people at UWA, researchers and postdocs and students doing different things around the country. But I also collaborate with people like the Australian Marine Parks, and I'll explain more about them in a minute. People at Parks and Wildlife, DBCA, like Sarah. People at fisheries, in charge of managing our fisheries. And also through these things called these marine and coastal and marine biodiversity hubs, which are national, federal level things for coordinating research to inform the conservation of our marine environment nationally. So I can have a slightly different view on stuff. Oh yeah, I'm from the UK originally. Just to introduce myself before I go on, so you know where I'm from and where my background is. And who my people are. So I'm from Jersey in the Channel Islands, little island, which is a neat place to visit. I started out as a lobster fisherman out of school, working on lobster boats at a friend's oyster farm. And then I loved the marine environment, wanted to do marine science, and so I travelled to New Zealand because it's a bit more exciting than Jersey in some ways. And there I did a PhD, again working with lobster fishermen, in particular the southern rock lobster, and looking at what they ate and things near the reef. But one of the things I did in New Zealand was used all their marine sanctuaries or marine reserves, these little places of the sea that we kind of don't disturb but observe and keep special to, and they're very useful for science, and they're actually shown in little dots of green around New Zealand there. But I compared basically the lobster inside outside and what they were doing. Now whilst I was in New Zealand, I was asked to monitor fish inside these places as well. And so I borrowed some of these things that Sarah was talking about, these stereo baited video thingies here being thrown off a boat, 2 cameras looking out in a bait bag essentially. I used them to look at some deep sanctuary zones or marine reserves that were proposed in New Zealand and saw these fantastic harpuka grouper in these deeper waters. And that was in about 2005. So then I came over to Western Australia to work on that data, and I met a lovely New Zealand lady in Perth and decided I should stay in Perth and not go back to New Zealand. And then one of my first things actually was to come down to the Nairi Capes area and run these diver video stereo swimming survey things that Sarah was talking about too in about 2006. So before the marine park went in, we were collecting benchmark information around the coast there on the fishes using that method and also the baited method as well that we threw in. Then my work at UWA kind of expanded along the coast. I've dropped all sorts of things in the sea, worked and seen lots of fish and habitats and worked with different lobster fishermen a fair bit in WA as well and kind of generally spread myself around lots of different projects. Nationally, we've done synthesis work, which is work to bring together a lot of that baited video data on fish or the diver video data on fish. And we've been doing that to try and get a better picture of the whole of Australia, so we can also understand things at a local level as well. So a couple of the outputs from that so far that we've done in collaboration with DBCA, Parks and Wildlife people and fisheries guys. Oh, yes, so these marine reserves things, just want to clarify what they are, because sometimes people get confused, okay? Now the reason you get confused is everybody in Australia, in every state, uses a different name for them, and in the Commonwealth waters they use a different name for them, which is pretty confusing, but it's the same thing. Essentially, it's highly protected areas of the sea, called marine sanctuaries, marine reserves, national park zones they're called as well, but all the same regulation where you're encouraged to visit and appreciate, and the objective is to be more natural and see what's going on, but you're not allowed to like mine it or blow it up or fish it or drag it or something like that. And we've got lots of those in Geographe Bay now, which we're going to get to in a minute. So, the work we've done nationally has found out ways to optimise those things, which are pretty obvious when it comes down to it. The bigger ones are better. The ones that have got places for fish to live in them are better as well. And the older ones are better. And if you actually leave it as a no-take area, it's better as well. So it's not too complicated. But that's a nice paper we sort of showed. Also, that's interesting, the ones that go from the shore and extend out to the deep tend to be really good as well, because they pick up all the different life history stages of the things that might be fished otherwise. Other really interesting paper that's come out of that so far, or study publication, which relates back to the person's question about the changes the last 30 years around here. Where's that person gone? Has he gone? Where's there? Where's there? Oh yeah. So, it's a big problem lacking historical benchmark data, because I've only been doing this video stuff for 20 years or so, and like, you know, it's none of that from before. But what we can do is we can look in other ways in our data sets, like in distance and far away from people. And so what we've done with this synthesis around Australia is show that in the really remote places where there's very little human influence, you find these really big fish much more likely. And in the places with lots of human influence, you find a lot less big fish. And that's kind of a proxy we have for looking at that, for trying to think about what would have happened back in time. And so in this way, we propose in this study that those sanctuary zones or marine reserves, whatever we call them, provide a window into our past and a vision for management, which is exactly what you said, which is pretty cool. Now, so around Australia, these dark green bits are called national park zones, but effectively marine reserves, sanctuary zone things, and also the dark green in here. Now, and the little tiny dots of green are more sanctuary zones around the coast. This is what we currently have at the moment. But they're in different jurisdictions, so it gets a bit confusing. Now, does anybody know why we have a difference between state waters, or does anybody know why the state water boundary is at 3 nautical miles, which is shown in red here? Sorry, yes? Andrew?
It goes back to the English-French wars, doesn't it, where the cannon that was fired from the shore could effectively travel 3 miles to...
Well done.
Well done. From the shore, so the English were trying to shoot the French, their cannon was effective out to 3 nautical miles.
Absolutely.
So that's why
so if you think back to where I'm from, which is a little English island surrounded by France, that's a very important thing. So where I'm from, we're surrounded by these old towers that were used to have cannons on top, and they could all fire about 3 nautical miles and keep the French away. Except when it was like a Sunday and everyone was in the pub and it was like low tide, then the French just walked in. They have a really big rise and fall of tide, and they just walked in and they've caught everyone by surprise. But we managed to persuade them to leave that time. But you know, it's the cannon rule. So because of that cannon rule, we have state waters in red around Australia, and then out to the 200 nautical mile zone, we have Commonwealth waters. So these green things, the dark green things here are the national park zones of the Australian Marine Parks Network around Australia, and inside the red we have all our state ones like the Nari Capes Marine Park. So in here, here's the Nari Capes Park. I haven't actually put the boundary on, sorry, but I've got the sanctuary zones shown in dark green. There we have our sanctuary zones, and the really cool thing here actually is we have a few of these national park zones, different word, same thing, in the Commonwealth waters, which link to them. So we've got one that links in Geographe and one that links here off Contos, off Margaret River. So that's a really nice way of linking together those kind of things. Now what we're looking at here in the Commonwealth waters is only a small part of what's called the Southwest Marine Park. That's called the Southwest Corner Marine Park. Okay, only if you lived in Canberra, I think, would you define that as the Southwest Corner Marine Park. I think, yes. And the Southwest network of the Australian Marine Park actually goes from Shark Bay to the Great Australian Bight. And that's definitely a Canberra perspective, I would suggest. But I really do appreciate working with these people, but I think it's a difference in perspective. So, okay, Geographe. Oh yeah. So some of the other stuff we do as well is about looking at the pressures, like Sarah was mentioning, the pressures that might be acting on our marine environment. So I've been doing national work to look at different pressures. So here's a national map of a recreational pressure around Australia, but we're doing it for things like recreational fishing and tourism and charter operators and just people visiting as well, like where people go visiting, to understand how all these things mesh together to better inform management at a national scale, but with local examples. Now, one of the reasons why the Geographe area and the southwest Narre Capes area is really interesting, I think, from a management point of view, from the state and the Commonwealth waters, is we have a lot of human visitation, human activities going on here. And this is just a heat map showing where people will go recreationally fishing in some of the surveys we did in the area. So it's really important to understand this so we can see where the pressures might be concentrated. And now you understand where I'm coming from working with people in Canberra, looking at stuff from a large perspective. You can see why it's kind of important to make them maps and pictures. People in Canberra like pictures. I'm just going to quickly introduce a bit of oceanography and a bit of geology, because it's actually really, really important. And it's probably stuff that you might already know from this area, going across it. But the Western Australia is strongly influenced by this thing called the Lewin Current, which comes down. We are the only landmass in the world that has a current, a warm current that comes down our coast and warms us up and stops upwelling, so it stops productivity. It makes us very infertile, which is a kind of a bit of a rude thing, but makes us very low nutrient, our marine system. It climatically buffers it, keeps us warm in the winter and cool in summer. And it's been going for about 60 million years, which is crazy, because 3,000 years ago, where I'm from, was under like a mile of ice. So, where you've been, you've had this current going down a landmass for 60 million years. And this is a theory that's been put together, this old, infertile, climatically buffered landscape by a professor in Albany, Steve Hopper, who's looked at the plant biodiversity in the area. And he's basically showed this sort of the coastal ridges, so not actually on the coast, but just back from the coast. The ridges along southwestern Australia have this incredibly high levels of species that are not found anywhere else, really fine-scale change in species ranges. It's called endemism, very high levels of endemism. And we've kind of, I stole this theory and took it to the sea. Oh yeah, so here's some plants. I stole it and used it for fish, which was cool. He didn't mind. I kind of asked him afterwards, but I changed the last word to seascape. So old, infertile, climatically buffered seascape. Because what we find in the sea, especially actually not necessarily in the shallows, but when you go a bit deeper, when it's a bit more stable and even more boring in some ways, you get the really fine distributions of species in southwest WA. We have more algal species and seagrass species and fish species per area and changeover in species than pretty much anywhere else in the world. And it's because of our geology and our history. It's really cool. And yeah, incredible diversity of seagrass and seaweed things. And yeah, lots of different seagrasses, which I'm supposed to be talking about. Other thing about seagrasses, we do a lot of work with lobster fishermen up the coast. In a lot of these areas where Kath was mentioning where the seagrass has been disappearing actually, which they're a bit worried about, which we should talk more about. WA has this incredible program to catch and monitor all the baby lobsters. This is a Purus. It's a planktonic lobster. It spent 9 or 11 months floating around the Indian Ocean and then somehow comes back to our shore. And this is when it first settles as a plankton, and then the next molt changes to a coloured little tiny baby lobster. And the question is, how many baby lobster are in this image? Because they're really hard to find. So there's kind of a missing information. We've got the most valuable species in Australia, fishery-wise, most well studied. No one knows where the babies go, basically, once they settle. No one knows, because it's this problem. They're so hard to find when you go and look for them in the wild. This is actually in a mesocosm, which is the only way I could find it in an aquarium. But yeah, Cassine, what? There's actually 3 somewhere in there. Oh no, there's. Oh, hang on, the next one's easier. Right? Oh, there's one in the middle, wasn't there? Yeah. So there's 3 in this one. So they're really well camouflaged on the edge of the sand, and we're seeing that we've done some experiments that show they really like the smell of this particular seagrass, this wireweed, or should we call it amphibolus? Okay, we'll call it amphibolus. They really like the smell of this seaweed, or at least the seaweed assemblage, everything that's together with it, which is really interesting to see. And they love hiding in it, and they bury at the bottom of these. Oh gosh, I was about to call it a stipe. Stems. Sorry, it's a plant with flowers. They bury at the bottom of them, and sometimes their antennae even look like the stems as well. They've got the same kind of stripe pattern on them. It's really, really cool. Okay, so important for our most valuable species, fishery species in Australia. Now, where am I going? Oh yeah. So, we've been doing work in the southwest corner as part of this work for the Parks Australia and the Marine Biodiversity Hub, and the Brollis and Ningaloo, but in particular also did some stuff in the offshore bits of Geographe. So I'm going to show deeper bits of Geographe, which I think are hopefully useful for everyone else. Now, as part of this, this map actually shows the old coastline pictures in the area. So we've got this sort of 11,000 coastline there shown in light green, and then the 21,000-year-old coastline would have been out here, which would have been hang on, is that during the Ice Age? It would have been 21,000 years ago, so that's how far the sea would have been out then. So all this would have been, you know, the land. And before we started these projects, we had a really cool cultural seascape mapping project conducted with Shannon, who's here, and the traditional owners in the area. I've got some Parks Australia people there to sort of understand some of the region before we started that work. And then we looked at the historical data, the biological historical data we could get from Geographe Bay. And actually in 2014, there was one of these federal programs in the offshore bits of Geographe Bay, in the Commonwealth waters, that collected a huge amount of data out there and had these are these submarines that Sarah was talking about, this autonomous underwater vehicle thing. Goes around by itself and takes photographs. And there was lots of other data sets collected there. That actually there's a whole load in 2014 in here as well, in the state waters, that I just haven't put on the map because this was a map for the federal people, not for the state people. And collected a whole lot of images of the bottom that have then been characterised. And we were supposed to go and redo some of this in 2020 in March. Oh dear. So we had this amazing Western rock lobster boat, who's a friend of mine in the fishery. That boat is so much bigger when you're up close to it, so cool. We were going to bring the robots, we were going to have this really cool ROV, underwater robot thingy, go and do it again, but it all got cancelled. And they couldn't come, because all these people are over in Sydney and Hobart, so they couldn't come. So luckily, been working with some local charter people, safari.com, Steve Mitchell, and he took us out with masks on and everything. That was in May, the first time we were allowed to go back out. And we developed these really cool, at the place up in Dongra where they make the lobster boats, we've been making some other equipment for sampling. Really cool tow video system, which looks like the Starship Enterprise with flotation tanks. And a really cool drop system we've made up with those guys. And because we've made them for other projects we're doing up and down the coast, we're able to bring them and use them here. Very cheap AUVs, or very cheap way of doing the same thing. We're getting the same data. And that was really cool. This is some of the imagery from the deeper, further out parts of Geographe Bay, which is almost around the corner, of some of those drop cameras. They're kind of like an almost 360 image of what's on the seabed. Not quite 360, but almost 360. It's a stereo calibrated image where we can measure everything and do things like that. Oh, hang on a minute. I'll try and play a video showing, I'll try and play the one that's in this folder, because it's going to be so much better. Is that okay? Yeah, so this is just some video from our tow video system. So we're out in the Commonwealth waters, so we're more than 3 nautical miles offshore, seeing these lovely deeper seagrass beds we've got out there, and that's in the National Park Zone, the Sanctuary Zone, Marine Reserve, whatever you want to call it, thing. There's also some beautiful coral bummies out there on the edges of some of the old limestone reef structures, which is really, really nice. And some quite complex bits of habitat out there. It's not all seagrass, for sure. There's a lot of other stuff further out. There's some sand, which is good to know. Sand's really important. I did my PhD on sand. Lobsters like eating stuff from sand. The habitat protection zone is really interesting, because further out in the habitat, inshore, it's got a lot of seagrassy bits, and then further out you start getting, there's an eagle ray, further out you start getting a lot more emergent kind of limestone bits of reef, and some sponge gardens. Where are the sponge gardens? Oh, more sand. It's not all sand, but where's the sponge gardens? Oh, here we go. This is in the habitat protection zone still. Some really, some finger sponges, jewfish, which is pretty cool. I hope everyone else can see the jewfish. See the jewfish? Anyway, lovely sponges. Really, really cool. So yeah, pretty nice out there actually. Pretty nice. All done with something we knocked up in someone's shed in Dongra. Right, oh, it's getting nicer. Anyway, lovely. So we got out to about 50 metres depth in the national park, or in the Commonwealth Marine Park. Right, stop. That's enough of that. So from that data, we were able to make some spatial maps of the extent of different habitats from some older data sets from 2014 and then the newer data sets we collected more recently. And here we've only done a prediction in the nearshore areas where there's some really good depth data existing, but you can do this whole prediction further offshore. It just looks a bit less neat when you do it further offshore because you don't have brilliant depth data out there, such detailed fine depth data. But no, it's really cool. And then we also did a really cool thing from 2014. We worked with some guys at AIMS, which is Australian Institute of Marine Sciences, and another lady at EWA, to use satellite imagery, historical satellite imagery, to track things over changes over time. And this then produced this other kind of map, you can see there, of vegetated across the Geographe Bay area. Now it's called vegetated because we've really got no idea what it is because it's a satellite image. But that's what all these dots are, and here is us dropping the cameras and checking to see what it really is with the in-water classification as well. Okay, I'm not brave enough to do it, but we've made because it's stereo imagery we took, we've made some 3D reconstructions of the seabed, and like that coral bombing, you can explore it in 3D, but I'm not going to do it here, it's too embarrassing in front of you all. I'll just look at some videos instead. The other things we did, we were supposed to also be working on the west coast, in this area out here, south of Margaret River, down here, with the robot thing, the normal baited video thing, and this new thing we made in the shed in Dongra, a drop camera thing that does the 360 image stuff. And yeah, saw some awesome things. Now I can. So the really cool thing about this national park zone, which joins into a marine sanctuary in the Canary Capes area. So here's the Brannup Hills, Contos Beach. So here's the state water mark. So this is the Canary Capes. And then this national park zone carries out and goes all the way off the shelf break, and goes down to 600 metres, which is crazy. And if you think about that back through time, that's probably our 8,000-year-old coastline, 13, and then our 20,000-year-old coastline will be down here, and then our 65,000-year-old coastline will be back here, because it's gone up and down. And we work with a local fisher to characterise these areas, and one of the reasons we developed this drop camera system is because the Lewin current runs so strong down this coast, especially in this area kind of like 60 to 200 meters. This is basically the Lewin current. It's a great big body of water rushing down the coast at about 3 to 4 knots. Whenever we dropped a baited video camera in here, we said goodbye to it. There's two. We lost 2 over here, and they're somewhere, don't know where they're. Southern Australia, Antarctica, Tasmania, maybe? We got to go around. But no, we lost them. So that's why we developed the drop system. We could just drop and hang onto it with a rope, so we knew we'd get it back. So that was really cool. Oh, okay. Do you want to see a couple of clips from the deep stuff there? It does have some seagrass in. So this is on those kind of 30 to 45 metre reefs just off Contos. Now you'll see in the background here is seagrass. Okay, forget about the fish, rubbish. And there's some lovely golden kelp here that Sarah talked about. And then here we got seagrass. Now I'm having a moment in my brain. Pachyrhizum. Thank you very much. The Lacidendron pachyrhizum, a deeper water seagrass species that we did see in that stuff in Geographe Bay as well, but we see it here off the west coast really quite beautifully. It's kind of on that 35, 45 metre edge. Yeah, how do you make this thing play? So there's a nice breaksea cod and a wobbegong. Oh, we're in the same place. Let's go deeper. So that's about there. Then if you jump down a bit further on the old reefs there, you'll notice all of a sudden the water's getting really blue, which is really cool. So now we're getting into the Lewin current, because the really cool thing about the Lewin current is it's so nutrient poor that it's really clear, and the water's really clear out there, which is really nice. And it very rarely gets into Geographe Bay. But here we have some of that, the Lacidendron pachyrhizum, looking beautiful and green and gorgeous here. And then some butterfly perch on the edge. Now we're down, oh, how deep was that? What did it say? 68 metres, 80 metres? We're on the edge of one of those ridges from kind of like 11 to 12,000 years ago. A lot less algae, but lots of nice sessile invertebrates and sponges. And a Sergeant Baker over there. Oh, a leather jacket. And pink snapper, but we don't want to talk about them, a bit boring. And the football sweeps are the yellow striped ones. So here's beautiful. Oh, now here we have. So we're back to 68 metres again. We've got a mixture of sponges and corals, but also some caulerpa. I was going to say, I forgot. Some caulerpa, and we have a lot of species of caulerpa here in WA as part of our incredible diversity of algae. And so here's some really cool deep water algae. And you see how blue the water is as well? Really, really pretty, super pretty blue water.
So what species of shark are
Gummy shark. I'm going to say it's a gummy shark. I'll say it's a gummy. I'm really a lobster biologist who studied clams for his PhD. Yeah. So here we are, 102, 116, 120 metres. It's like, what's that film with the blue people in? Avatar, yeah. It's like Avatar, I reckon. It's like electric. This is 120 metres deep. It's electric blue, the water. It's crazy. And these incredible sessile invertebrate thingies. And beautiful cuttlefish are in the background there as well. Then at 140 metres, we found a blooming aggregation of these guys. There's 5 of these guys in the national park zone. I don't know how they knew they had to aggregate in the national park zone, but they're out there in 140 metres around a little point of reef. There's just 5 grey nurse sharks going round and round in circles. So, oh, I better stop. Okay, last video. Oh, then it doesn't give you the last video. Oh well, the last video was the harpooker that we saw in New Zealand. We've now found, well, everyone knows they're off here because everyone likes to fish it. But down on the shelf break, it's 250 metres deep. There's beautiful schools of these big harpooka grouper. That's a really interesting question. I'd have to ask an oceanographer. It would definitely be cooler because that current's coming from the south. You changed currents when you go over the shelf. It's the undercurrent, so definitely cooler. It's a really interesting question. Thanks very much.
Thank you.